pleased. Okay, so off my pedestal there. First of all, I would like to see, because as Vance points out, we're in risk reduction mode at this point. We have waste leaking out of a tank. We should approach it from the standpoint of the risk and the fact that what we're doing is essentially having some a natural attenuation of the isotopes in the substructure of the earth above the groundwater table, maybe below it. So what we need to be looking at our risk is from the standpoint of what isotopes are leaking out, what isotopes aren't we getting, and what is the risk to the people? Because they're not all getting through. There are some that are more cation receptive than others that are sticking to the soil and things of that sort, and we know that. But we need a better understanding that if we allow this to continue to tank after tank, 109, 107, 107, if it has more tanks with this same issue, we need to know what it is that we're looking at to evaluate that risk. So I think that that's important. And the only other statement I wanted to say is that Vince Pinesco and I, we had talked, and he introduced me to a document I forgot back in 1995. It was the option study for what to do with the waste in our tanks, and especially the leaking waste. And in that, barriers were considered. And Savannah River did some studies and calculations on subsurface barriers under their tanks and under areas they want to protect. Well, that study in 1995 is now 25 years old. Since that 1995 timeframe, we've introduced lots of new materials, and especially the nanophase materials. There are commercial outfits now that are using directional drilling and using colloidal silica nanoparticles to create barriers underneath contaminating sources. And so I think that part of your option study needs to pull back that old document and relook at some of those ideas and say, what has changed in technology that would allow us to say, maybe this is a workable option? Because if you could put in a 200 square foot barrier, on the bottom of a series of tanks, you could essentially delay this where your natural attenuation would way lower the risk. My comments. Thank you very much. Oh, I like your presentation, Karthik. I really enjoy listening to you talk. You're very thorough. Thank you.
Are there others who wish to make public comment at this time? Any member of the public? Right. All right, Mr. Chair, it's about 3:20. We blew through the break. The other two things on the agenda are the introduction of the draft advice. Jeff Burright has a framing of that to share from the
Excuse me, I did want to make a comment.
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry, I couldn't get the technology to work for me. This is Nancy Morris.
Oh, yes, Nancy.
It'll be fairly brief. I'm actually very concerned about the agency's comments regarding the 25 years until liquid waste from B109 or even the other tanks reaches groundwater. And the modeling could be so very wrong, and I'm saying this based on other very, very articulate comments by other members of this entire discussion. And so I'm just saying, as a very concerned citizen who is looking at the future generation, is why not deal with this B109 now instead of waiting for an unknown future? Because how many times already have our climate change models been so very wrong? And that's quite often. The climate change is rapidly unfolding much faster than modeling had predicted. And that said, the modeling for leaking tanks to take 25 years could also be so very wrong. And so I'm saying now is the time to act and not be so complacent in this modeling agenda or predictions, and that unfortunately so many past mistakes have been made in terms of prediction in the Hanford waste issue, that I think now is the time to act, and that our agencies really have to move forward much faster than they are. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Right. So we've got two more pieces on today's agenda, and we've got the introduction of the draft advice from the Tank Waste Committee. Jeff Burwright is here with us and has information to share with the board on the background of the advice and how it came to be, and then a smattering of board business. Shall we just jump in, or do people need 5 minutes to take a lap around the living room?
I think we're kind of in a flow right now. If Jeff is willing, I would suggest we go ahead with the introduction of the advice.
Right. Jeff's taken the screen and has his presentation ready to go.
That's actually not me in control. I've just requested it. So.
Oh, it's not me either. Okay, Jeff has the screen.
Still not yet. Oh, wait, here we go.
Okay.
Just a moment.
What technology is?
Sorry, folks. Can everybody see the title there?
Single shell tank leak response potential advice, September 2021.
Lovely. Okay. We've teed up so much of this already in this conversation that I'll probably speak less than I intended. I was asked by the group that put this advice together to provide some of the same information for this group that I was providing during our discussions, just unearthing documents and figures. And really the idea here is we want everyone on the board to see with their own eyes some of the inputs to the advice that's before you now. You've seen this already today. It's familiar to us from the presentation and the formal leak assessment report for B109. As we know, it illustrates the story of a sudden loss of liquid from the tank, which initiated the leak assessment process and ultimately that conclusion that the tank is leaking. As reported by DOE, prior to the start of the leak, the tank contained approximately 13,000 gallons of liquid in the pore space. And I get this wrong sometimes, but there was also this pool above containing approximately 2,000 gallons of free liquid. So I get a little confused about whether it was 13,000 or 15,000. As Karthik has showed you already, here was what they found in 2014. And as I read earlier to Karthik, back in 1985, they confirmed that the surface of the tank was dry. And then in 2014, they came in and discovered that liquid had somehow intruded into the tank. It's estimated, as he said, 46% of the surface was covered, kind of like a lake with a dry salt shore. After they discovered the drop in that white and red chart that was on the first slide, they went back in 2020 to take a look. And as Karthik mentioned, the pool had shrunk to 9% of the surface area. And a little over 4 months later, 136 days, they went back for another look. And this time the free liquid portion of the pool was estimated to be about 4% of the surface. It's my belief that if they went back again today in September, that pool will be gone and you'd just be looking at salt. I think it's fair to say, and we've heard a lot of different reports, but the exact leak rate and leak amount is uncertain because it's a very complex math problem with lots of variables and unknowns. But we did see that DOE did perform their estimate based on the methods available to them. And based on that estimate, we have somewhere around 10 years until all the leakable liquid from this tank is gone. It could be less time if the rate is faster than estimated, or it could be more time if the leak stops or slows down on its own for some reason. What I want to show you next, this is a figure from System Plan 8, which is kind of the big master plan for the whole tank mission. It includes not only treating the waste, but retrieving the tanks. And what you're looking at here is what was their best estimate at the time of the sequence of tanks that they would be retrieving and when they would be doing it. It's very small print, so I pointed out with a red arrow where B109 sits in the timeline based on their latest plans. So starting sometime in 2044, and it'll take a few years to fully retrieve that tank. So we're looking at quite a long time until the risk is completely gone, if you will. And as we've talked about here today, unless you somehow cover the top of that tank, you might still have liquid coming in and basically filtering through the salt and the sludge on its way out to the environment. Also, I'll mention that this timeline assumes a lot of things about when the waste treatment plant will be ready, as well as an expectation that we get faster retrievals than we have been, and that we have the funding to complete all the infrastructure upgrades that are necessary. And speaking of infrastructure, this is also from System Plan 8, and it shows how waste moves around the site from the tanks as you're retrieving them. Any gray dotted lines you see are planned future construction that does not currently exist. Also, for the B complex farms there in the top center and the T complex farms, because they're so far away from the waste treatment plant, DOE has actually been assuming that they would have to build a 6-pack of tanks locally at each farm location to help them flush and recirculate the retrieval water and then be able to pump it the miles it has to go to the nearest double shell tank. They call them waste receiving facilities, and the one for B farm isn't due to be built until the mid-2030s, and that probably has a lot to do with funding and availability. There are also around 2 miles of pipe that would need to be built across the site to shuttle that waste. You also have to account for the time and the cost of setting up all the retrieval equipment, the power, the water, controlling any emissions, and all of that, which itself could cost hundreds of millions of dollars. And as we've heard in the Tank Waste Committee, take at least 2 to 4 years to mobilize. So when you ask the question, or if anyone were to ask the question, why can't we just retrieve the tank today, the whole tank? This is why we're seeing DOE say in the newspaper and elsewhere, talking about just the extraordinary cost that it would take if we were to bring B farm to the front of the line. And so just wanted to support the idea. DOE isn't blowing smoke when they say that it's not an easy thing to retrieve a leaking single shell tank on short notice. So where does that leave us? Let's see here. Uh-oh. There we go. Just to zoom in at B farm. So this relates to what I'm showing you here is from the best basis inventory for B109. And I only focused on 2 of the radionuclides. And Rob, this might get to some of the things you were talking about and others. You know, what is actually in this interstitial liquid itself? What can we guess is actually hitting the soil? And we know because they did the dry well logging outside the tank that there was a very high gamma signature. To me, that says there's a good amount of cesium in whatever liquid is there. And as you can see here, the salt cake interstitial liquid has 253 curies of cesium in the liquid and about 550 curies in the solid. But you have to remember too that the solid is 59,000 gallons and the liquid is 13,000. So it's basically twice as concentrated in that interstitial liquid. And then take Tech 99 because that's a common groundwater concern, moves fast, lasts a long time. You're looking at 0.1 curies in the interstitial liquid, and in the solid, about double that. But if you think about it in picocuries per liter, which is how we grade our drinking water standards, my calculation is that's about 3 million picocuries per liter. Now, granted, people aren't drinking the leaking liquid out of the tank, but you have to imagine that that's a significant introduction to the groundwater beneath. I also did look at iodine 129, and that's about 4,200 picocuries per liter by my calculations. Jerry mentioned this. This table comes from a study from 2020 that was requested by Ecology and performed by DOE and its contractors to look at what additional options might be available to remove more liquid from the single shell tanks beyond what was done back in the 80s and 90s. This was not assuming a leak scenario. It was just saying, are there more technologies that we could look at? And there were two that were the top. You see enhanced salt well pumping, which is something that we've talked about here, as well as ventilation or recirculation, which also relies on enhanced salt well pumping, and that was something that Liz also brought up. Both rely on this enhanced salt well pumping to get more liquid out of the bulk of the waste and up to the surface. And they scored the highest because of their technical maturity and likelihood of success, according to the report. But again, what's not discussed in the study is whether something like this will work quickly enough to beat a leak. This is a picture of what enhanced salt well pumping looks like. It's not dissimilar from the interim stabilization that they already did on the SSTs, but basically they would make the larger salt screens and better pumps. And as I mentioned before, apparently this was well proven at Savannah River. This is the other one, the recirculation, where, as Karthik mentioned, when you blow air across the surface of the tank, you're only getting that surface amount of liquid. So what this would do is pull liquid from the bottom of the tank and mist it in the air so that when you blow the air across that, it's helping to dry it out better. So these were the two top technologies. Now, following this study, Ecology wrote a letter to the Department of Energy pointing out these two technologies and recommending that DOE work with Ecology to develop a work plan and schedule to conduct field testing of these two technologies. Select two single shell tanks, one for the ventilation and one for salt well pumping. And I'll note that this was from December of 2020, so it was before it was formally known that there was a new tank leaking. In the Tank Waste Committee, we've heard about a double shell tank leak response plan, but there is no existing leak response plan for the single shell tanks, and we've heard that talked about today. And as I mentioned, based on the monthly tank status reports, there are currently 3.37 million gallons of drainable interstitial liquid or free supernate sitting in the remaining SSTs today. So 13,000 in B109, 3.37 million across the other single shell tanks. And so we talked about this in our small group, the idea that we need to be thinking beyond B109 and consider how many more single shell tanks could potentially release their liquids to the environment because we just couldn't get to them in time. Do we know what the risk of that would be so we can know what it's worth to avoid it? And Rob mentioned this as well just a few minutes ago. So we need to be thinking ahead harder together. Now I get to the main points of the proposed advice, which hopefully you've had a chance to read and digest it. Just very quickly here, remove leakable liquids from leaking tanks as quickly as feasible. Create a leak response plan for the single shell tanks, all of them, and then have stakeholder input on that. We are specifically requesting a feasibility assessment for B109. We want to run all potential options to ground, understand their costs, their benefits, what their true technical feasibility is, and seek public input on that. And you'll see in the background of the advice, as I was mentioning earlier, we kind of played with putting some different Lego blocks together to say, do we have some new tools that we could put together to perhaps give us a rapid response capability? And we'd like to understand more about that. Related to that, invest in research and development to increase our agility to respond to future single shell tank leaks. Number 5, check the soil around the tanks sooner in the leak assessment process. This is in response to that leak assessment report that was done, where as one of their final steps, they went out and did borehole logging outside the tank and found out, wow, we have a spike of cesium in the soil right at the bottom of the tank level. And that really clinched it for a lot of the experts that this was a leak and not something else they were observing. And they talked about whether they ought to do it at their first meeting in July of 2020, but they didn't get around to it till the end of March of 2021 after they had tried some other things. So we're just saying maybe move that up. Next, include Ecology and other non-DOE contractors, or at least consider it, in the leak assessment process so that you can have more input earlier on, people looking at different angles on trying to answer that question, whether a tank is leaking. And then finally, exploring options to build retrieval infrastructure quicker and easier. Basically, can we lay track ahead of time to make our retrievals any faster in the bigger picture? And then the last thing I'll show you, this is a letter from just last month. After we'd already been developing this advice, it was a letter from Department of Ecology to DOE talking about B109 and T111. And you've heard some of this today, but they're meeting weekly, they're agreeing to continue discussions, and they talk about leak response actions for both tanks and site-wide leak response plan for all single shell tanks. So what this says to me is that our advice is so actionable that the agencies have already begun to take some of the actions, and I take that as a good thing. So that's all I've got for you. I am curious to know what you all think. Thank you.
I originally saw Carrie's hand up, but I don't know. He's not showing as actively.
I just
Right there.
to figure it out. I wanted to know where the one chart was from because I wanted to pull it up, but then Jeff explained, so I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. Steve Anderson, you've got your hand up. What's on your mind?
No, thanks, Jeff. I thought that was good, and I do think that we should be excited by the fact that the agencies are already taking steps toward what we're suggesting. I was curious as to what kind of oversight there is to the borehole logs and how often those occur and how they stack up. I saw your semblance of how they are looking to retrieve on the date line, which was very interesting. But I'm hoping that if there are any potentially leak-prone tanks, that those are obviously moved up in the sequence of emptying them. So yeah, just how often are those boreholes looked at, and you know, in terms of tank integrity, I'm just curious. Thanks.
All I can say is that's a good question. we don't know. I don't know.
Steve Wigman.
Yeah, just a operational question. Given the fact that the agencies are already talking about the kinds of things that we're talking about in our advice, is the advice necessary? Will it inspire them to keep digging, act quicker? I'm not saying I don't like the advice. I think all the points you've covered are wonderful. I'm just wondering, my immediate reaction when we talked about the advice was, well, this is already in the regulatory process, and it sounds like the regulatory process may already be working well. So I'm curious, will this advice have any impact at this point?
Steve, are you thinking of input from HAB members, or you would like a reflection from the TPA agencies, or both?
I would probably enjoy both. Mostly I'm interested in reflection from the TPA agencies. I don't have any problem with us proceeding with the advice. I'm just curious what its impact is going to be. And maybe that's too big of a question.
Steve, this is David Bowen with Ecology. Really appreciate the question. And Jeff, thank you for the presentation and overview. You know, we are a science-based organization, and any advice that comes our way is going to be considered and influence, you know, how we work on things. So I would recommend that you continue on the path you're on, and if your board members decide it's something worth bringing forward, to please do continue.
Thank you for that response. That helped.
From DOE's perspective, I would say that I've seen a lot of different reports that were referenced here today, things that I really appreciate hearing more about. The advice, as both Jeff and Steve referenced, is relatively aligned with the steps being taken between the department and with ecology right now. So, you know, it's really up to the board if they want to pursue the advice and continue on. I think the discussion is probably the most beneficial aspect of this, and making sure people understand all of the data. There's a lot of data, but all of the options as well. And then hearing about the agencies engaging and working together, that's another important aspect of this. We heard David mention earlier today the importance of constructive tension between the regulator and the agency. And I think we're building that better than we have in the past. Thanks.
Right. I have Chris, Pam, Jerry, and Liz. Chris.
Yeah, this is Chris. Brian Vance stressed a number of times this morning, 2 or 3, that the HAB can be most beneficial in its advice if it advises on things 3 to 5 years in the future. That gives DOE time to act on the advice or to get funding for the advice, whatever. So my suggestion is in this advice, maybe rephrase it somewhat so that it's clear that we're talking about things that can be done in the future regarding response plans or contingency plans for tank leaks. I think if any part of the advice is unique to tank 109, that what we'll get at least as a partial response from DOE is just what we heard from Brian Vance this morning. No risk to the public and the workforce, minimal risk to the environment. The amount of leak is minimal relative to the contamination already there. So I would really focus the advice to try and meet 3 to 5 years in the future, and that is develop plans and have the advice based on planning. And a lot of the things that you talked about, Jeff, could be rolled in as subpoints to a plan. That's my comment.
Right. Pam and then Jerry. Pam?
Well, as has been pointed out, the information we received today wasn't available in the early stages of development of the advice. And so I would tweak it a bit to congratulate Ecology and DOE for the direction they're moving in, to define what we hope to see in the future. And I'm not sure 5 years out, I'm going to agree with Brian on that. I mean, that's true with budget advice. But in this context, it is budget related, because if you're developing new tools and new capabilities, you're going to have to sell DOE headquarters and OMB. And so they should be prioritizing that. So coming up with a strategy, because this is not just one tank, as I said earlier, this is a bunch of tanks. And I love the toolbox option. So I would tweak the advice a bit to be complementary, because I think we have the opportunity to do that. And by the way, David, I'm so encouraged by Ecology's position and your leadership. It just makes my heart happy. And so let's build on that. And let's look to the long term, because this one tank is not it. There's so much more. Anyway, thank you for all the work you did in putting this advice together, Jeff. And I just think if we tweak it with the information we've got and look more constructively to the future, that it will be valuably received. Thank you.
I have Jerry and then Liz. Jerry.
Thank you. First off, Jeff, thank you for weeks and weeks of work and reviewing data and pulling it together so effectively for all of us. And really, you know, we talk about how the board board can only be effective based on the work of volunteer effort and in committees, and this incredible effort shows that. Thank you very much. Secondly, I think we need to go back to the start of today. What I heard today was a dismal and really disturbing effort to try to defend doing absolutely nothing in regard to tank B109 at the outset of the day. You all heard it. It was said that the, quote, environmental insult, unquote, was small. You've heard this ridiculous notion of why do anything? We've got pump and treat in place. Board members who've been around know that tank waste, tank closure, waste management, EIS, did extensive modeling of what happens to groundwater underneath the tanks from tank leaks, and showed that it basically pulses, the contaminants pulse into the groundwater over a 10,000 year period, far above drinking water standards, over and over and over again. Ain't no one talking about funding pump and treat for 100 years, much less 500 or 10,000. And it is an affront to all the principles of do no further harm, which this board has embraced, and the concept, the basics of our Superfund law and our hazardous waste laws to say we can allow a tank leak to continue to unabated, even if it was only the first. But what we've heard overwhelmingly is it's not the first, and there are going to be many more to come, and that there are millions of gallons of drainable interstitial liquid in these tanks. So it's vital, I think, that we offer advice that says right now, yeah, ecology, and I've had great discussions with David and senior management at ecology. Yeah, ecology knows we need a response and has said that it's inappropriate to say do nothing, but you haven't heard that from the top leadership at the Hanford site. And I think we need to be offering advice that says you have to respond. And secondly, for years, this board has said before, and many of us on the board have repeatedly said, where's the response plan for tank leaks? And this advice not only says respond now, but also says let's put in place with strong public involvement what the permit is going to require as a transparent and credible response plan for all the leaks that are likely to come, so that we don't have this debate in another 6 months with another tank. This is an avoidable debate. We should have had the plan in place. We should have a permit requirement, and we should have had public comment on it just like any other permit modification, and extensive board review. And that isn't a 3 to 5 year window. That's a 1 year window for us to get cracking and working on. So I urge support, and I hope that what will go around is hear people's views, as we've heard, and take note of it so that, I mean, it sounds to me like there's strong support for making sure that we have a plan and a response. And that's really important to support where ecology has said it wants to go, which is not quite the same as what I heard today. Just because they're meeting doesn't mean that they've agreed or will agree. And it's very important for us to put this forward. Thank you.
All right, I have Liz and then back to Chris. Liz.
Thanks. And I'm going to just help out Bob here, who has some comments in the chat to make sure they're put out there. And I agree. Bob has in here that he thinks the advice is important to go forward. And I agree. I think it's helpful to have this on the record. It's great to have a conversation here, but it's one thing to put it out, and I think there might be work for the issue manager team to do to take some of the conversation today and make sure it's reflected in the advice so that we have a productive discussion when we meet again in October. And there may be some logistical work to make sure there's there's a different situation we're in, to have the advice kind of go through the issue manager team and then have some kind of last minute tank waste committee meeting so that the committee can come to consensus so it can come back to the board. The other comment that Bob has, I'll just read here. Thanks, Karthik, for the tank B109. Oh, no, I missed it. Sorry. I agree with Chris's comment. The primary focus of this advice is to request that the site be prepared to address further leaks in the single shell tanks. Not every potential future leaking tank may be in a situation that we can allow them to leak to the environment and just ignore it. We will see more leaking tanks in the future and need to be prepared to address them. And I think we're kind of all on the same page. This is Liz speaking. I think we're all on the same page that the future issue of the bigger picture of all the leaking tanks that could happen in the future is like a really core concern of the board. So hopefully we can also have some time in tank waste committee to talk about that too, and not just have it be part of our advice. Thanks so much.
So my process suggestion, to not further complicate what is already complicated, is if this were a normal board meeting, we'd have this discussion, identify some of the tweaks that you would like to see in the advice, and we actually would work sort of in the evening overnight to give you a new version in the morning. Let me suggest that we can pretend that the next board meeting is actually the next day and not have to invoke running another set of draft advice through an interim committee meeting. Let's keep it simple. And with your permission, just ask the issue manager team to make those minor revisions and bring it back the next time the group convenes, and keep it simple, if that is acceptable to you. I don't want to inflict more conference calls on you if we don't have to. Chris, you're up.
Yeah. Jeff, my comment here has to do with the background section and not the advice. I think there's three pieces of information that could be very powerful in the background section towards setting the stage for the advice, particularly if advice is oriented toward the future. One of them is that graph you showed, that chart you showed, where each of the single shell tanks is scheduled to be emptied into the VIT plant, and the time frame that schedule encompasses, very long. Along with that, if you remember, I think last fall we heard a presentation by DOE on System Plan 9, which is their latest plan for how long it's going to take and the cost it's going to take for various scenarios to remediate all the waste in the tanks and empty the tanks. And if I remember right, all the vitrification was supposed to be done by somewhere in the mid-60s under their preferred alternative. Again, that's a long period of time. And then the third point is, if you accept that 25 years for something to reach groundwater and look at the period of time that is in System Plan 9 and look at that length of time that's in that chart you showed, that gives ample opportunity for a lot of leaks to reach groundwater from a large number of tanks. I think if maybe you had those three pieces of information in along with some of what you have, it could set the stage nicely for the rest of your advice.
Thanks, Chris.
How about we open public comment right now if there are lapsed board members or members of the public? I'll check in with you, Nancy, who want to make comment as they've listened to the discussion. Tom Galeotto, I have you on my list.
Great. It's a great place to be, Ruth. Thank you. I was hoping to get this question asked for me, but I don't think I got it in time to be asked for me. So the question I had was to Jeff and others. Have we heard anything during today's presentations and discussions that would change in any significant way this particular draft advice? I think from the comments that I've heard on the discussion, while there may be some tweaks and minor changes, the advice, I think most people feel the advice should go forward, and I certainly do. I certainly agree with Bob and Jerry and Liz and one or two others that have commented that this is something that has to be documented. The shortcomings in the planning and the potential risks have to be addressed. And the only way we have to do that by the board is to issue advice. So my comment publicly is that we should move forward and issue this advice as quickly as possible. So thank you.
So I'm going to hold the questions for just a sec and check, are there other public comments that we need to capture before we go back to the board discussion? I know this is awkward. Tom Cecilia, you have a question. Then I'm going to go to Jeff.
Yeah, so did you hear anything in today's talks that would cause the advice to change? I think was the gist of the question that Tom Galeotto just asked. So let's ask that one.
Yeah, I was just about to say, it occurs to me some people might wonder if anything from today changed. Yeah, I really listened for it. And, I heard things that could potentially change whether the specific combination of Legos that we talk about in the background might be the answer. But I also was offering some challenges to what I was hearing. And I want to see something formal. And as Jerry was talking about, we need to understand the relative costs. I'm really curious to know if anyone's ever looked at the total risk cost if this keeps happening. And I asked the question and no one has had an answer for me yet. I'd love to see what it looks like. Well, I don't want to see what it looks like, but I think we need to see what it looks like if we are not successful in retrieving these other tanks that contain interstitial liquid before they lose those liquids. So I think that in simple terms, we're asking them to chase B109 to ground, look at all the options and look at them hard. And I still want that, despite what we heard today. Even if the outcome is similar to what we heard today, it'll be more than a PowerPoint. And I think that that's important. We're talking about the big picture, and we're talking about the need for a single shell tank leak response plan writ large. I still think we need it. I think everyone agrees that it'd be a good idea if we had more tools in our belt to respond to something like this in the future. I understand there's a debate on whether it's worth it. I would rather focus the discussion on, can we find a tool that is reasonable enough in cost that it just makes sense. The other pieces of our advice about being nimble and, we haven't really talked about should there be more parties to the leak assessment process earlier? Right now, it's mainly just the contractor group that gets together and looks at the data. And their assessment process began in July of 2020. And remember, it first started dropping in December of 18, and then it stabilized in the spring of 19, which coincided with a lot of snowmelt, by the way, and then kept going. And then they initiated the formal leak assessment in July of 20. And then they finally decided that, yes, it had leaked by April of 21. I'm still kind of unclear on when ecology was read into the fact that, hey, we're looking at data. And it just seems like a good idea to to make sure that they're party to those kinds of discussions. So short answer is to the question that I heard in the wind is I still believe that our advice points make sense. Thank you.
Right. Steve Wigman, where are we now on draft advice and going into board business?
I get the sense that this draft advice is definitely a part of our future. I agree with that. One thing we haven't talked about, I don't think we're going to get to talk about it for a while, is closure of the tank farms and what that actually means and whose lifetime that might occur in. But I think we absolutely are going to have to learn how to deal with these tanks during this time when they are going to leak and they're going to continue to cause us problems. So I definitely agree that this advice needs to go forward, and whatever adjustments you guys want to make to it, make them. And in our next meeting, we'll hopefully have the full board back in place, and we can have that final conversation.
Right. So the optimistic, hopeful plan is that the board packet will be approved really soon in time for an October board meeting. Originally on the calendar, it was a new member orientation. We still want that to happen. We have actively talked, the tri-party agencies met this morning with the HAB leadership, your chair and your vice chair, to talk about 3 things that could happen in October if we can get this packet signed. So keep your fingers crossed. New member orientation, action items from this meeting, things like draft advice and adopting the work plan for fiscal year 22, as well as an overview of the updated 5-year plan. So those are the 3 components that are under discussion, contingent on getting it to where we don't have this awkward lapsed member situation, which wasn't what we wanted for this meeting. So, Steve, is there any other board business we need to do?
Well, not that jumps back into my brain.
Steve, this is Pam. I've been asking to be allowed to do a 5-minute presentation on what's going on nationally. And I was in Canada when the executive committee met, so I wasn't party to the conversation that was not going to allow committee reports. I mean, people can turn off the phone if they don't want to hear it, but if you would allow me to do that, I would appreciate it at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
Well, I'm always curious what's happening nationally. Do other folks agree that they want to hear that?
I agree.
I see nods. Go ahead.
Okay, I'll be quick. DOE headquarters, staff changes within the last couple of weeks. Mike Narker, the former EM communications director, is now chief of staff. In addition to supporting EM 1 and 2, he'll provide assistance and advice to senior EM managers on everything from operations to long-range planning. In the past, he has served as EM chief strategist and the head of congressional services. He's the former editor of the Exchange Monitor publications. Eric Olds is now acting director of communications. He's actually moved to Washington, D.C., and he was named this month to serve as senior advisor to Todd Schrader, EM2. The deputy chief of staff for EM is officially Allison Finelli. She's been in different EM jobs since June 2015. She was previously the deputy director of the Energy Community Alliance, and I've known her since she graduated from college. She's my dear friend. EM1 appointment. The Biden administration is starting to weigh potential nominees for a permanent assistant secretary for environmental management. Names rumored to be under discussion include Monica Regal-Buto, who held a position from 2015 to 2017. Nicole Nelson-Jean, she's presently EM3. She's put her own name forward, I believe. A third candidate is rumored to be Jim Werner, who is the Legacy Management Program guy. We dealt with him on long-term stewardship years ago, and I think he might have been the Beamer guy too. He's now with the Congressional Research Service. Budget information. The House passed a fiscal 2022 energy and water budget on July 29th, which includes DOE. The EM program was funded at $7.76 billion. This is a $1.71 million increase over 2021. The Senate committee passed the bill on August 4th, but it's not been passed by the full Senate. In 2018, Congress directed DOE to evaluate the cost savings of treating some defense high-level waste based on its technical composition versus origin. The report indicated that treatment of some Hanford low-activity waste by grouting could save $73 to $210 billion and reduce the mission by a decade. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Pam. So are we wrapping up?
That's up to you.
I want to thank everybody for working with this awkward situation we had today, for not being able to have a full quorum and be able to vote on things. But I think that the discussion has been very productive, and I appreciate everybody's time.
The plan for October, quite frankly, we're still trying to figure it out depending on the package. We're operating in there's a lot we don't know, and there's a lot we want to get done if we can do it.
Yeah, and I don't want to make any assumptions about the approval of the package. I think we were all pretty optimistic, and reality set in, and reality is going to have to play out before we can really get our feet on the ground. So, unless there's any final comments from folks, I think we're done for today.
We had a question from Emmett. I want to make sure it doesn't get lost. It's in the chat for Pam.
Okay. Emmett, do we know what type of impact this has on us? What impact what has on us?
What you just said.
Well, Eric Golds is now in the office of the Assistant Secretary of Environmental Management. I think that's a good day. You know, we've fared well again. The president's budget was going to cut RL, I think, $100 million, because I think PFP is done, and the House Appropriations Committee has restored that money. We don't know what the Senate's going to do, but we're faring well. And you know, it's a new administration. The fact that they haven't appointed an EM1 is interesting, but I think Ike has been respected by the secretary and the others in the department. So I don't know. General comments.
Fair. Thank you.
So we've got a process question that I actually think we need to take, which is awkward. Tom, you've got a question on committee activities prior to approval of the membership package.
Right. Yeah.
Except that you're a lapsed member, but ask it anyway, because there's no way around this.
Yeah, we're at the end of the meeting anyway. They can cut us off, I guess. I apologize first for all of the typing errors on my comments. I'm trying to type with a wrist brace, and I do try to do it quickly so I can get my comments in. Anyway, the question is, this advice, for example, that we just talked about on the B109, the potential advice on the budget activities, which we'll talk about in the EIC meeting next week, and others, I'm sure, will all require committee-related activities in the next couple weeks. So my question is, are those activities permitted prior to the package approval from headquarters? Thank you.
That's a good question. My sense was we were doing committee activities up until now, and then we couldn't do normal business in this meeting. So I don't know the answer to that. That would have to come from DOE.
So my suggestion is there is an EIC call a week from today. So we probably need to ask that on the EIC call to give DOE time to figure out the answer. Right?
Are our lapsed members allowed to participate in that EIC call?
Oh. Can I bang my head on the desk now? We do have committee chairs and vice chairs who are on the lapsed list, which was part of our heartache today.
Gary might be able to answer this.
We'll figure it out as we go. That's the best answer that I have. It's not satisfactory. We're figuring it out as we go.
Gary, if I can make a quick comment on that, just to bring back some perspective from the budgeting process at the federal level, we can continue to fund government work with a continuing resolution. So let's apply the continuing resolution idea to include this. We can proceed. But I'll leave that up to you.
Yeah, we'll have a response for you in the next couple of days. Hopefully, the next time you hear from me, I'll be saying that the packet has been approved and business as usual. My fingers are trying to cross.
Bob Sioma, I am hoping it's a process question, right?
Yes, for the tank waste committee members, both Susan and I are on the lapsed list, so you have no leadership. I'll be or Ruth will be sending out a message after the EIC call on how we're going to work our way through that. But that'll be a major issue. And then I think we do need a issue manager call on this advice, just to finalize where we are. I think we did it very well with the teams last time, and it gave us an opportunity for everybody to put their comments in. So we'll let you know on what happens after the EIC call. Thank you.
I will take it upon myself, Bob, to schedule an IM team follow-up from this meeting.
Okay, thank you. Great job, Jeff.
Hey, Steve, I really think that we're on the right track, putting all this emphasis on those tanks, because it's likely to be a big bathtub curve. You know, we get a leak this year, leak in a couple more years, and 2 leaks 3 years after that. We need to understand the scope here, and I think it's really important that we keep pressing this issue. And of course, I truly believe that we need to finish the mission, and so the WTP mission. So thank you. I think we're on the right track.
Right now, B109 is scheduled on my 100th birthday. We were supposed to be completely done by my 100th birthday, so I don't believe schedules anymore. So we've got to prevent further harm if we can.
Agreed.
Thank you all. Stay well.
Take care, everybody.
Have a good day.